There was a girl at the University of Texas in Austin whose voice could silence an entire room. But before the world ever heard that voice, before the stadiums, before the standing ovations, before the name Janis Joplin meant anything at all, something happened on that campus in 1963 that she would carry with her for the rest of her short life. Something so cruel, so public, so humiliating that it shaped every note she would ever sing. And the strangest part of this story is that the people who tried to destroy her that day had no idea they were about to create one of the most powerful voices in the history of music. But Janis Joplin's real story was not visible when the applause started. It was visible in the years before anyone clapped for her at all. It was the fall of 1962 when Janis first arrived at the University of Texas. She was 19 years old, carrying a suitcase full of secondhand clothes, an auto harp, and a head full of dreams that did not fit the world she was walking into. She came from Port Arthur, a small oil refinery town on the Gulf Coast of Texas, where the sky was always a little gray from the smoke and the people were always a little closed in their thinking. She had spent her entire childhood feeling like a ghost in her own hometown. Too loud for the quiet girls, too strange for the popular boys, too curious for a town that did not reward curiosity. Her parents, Seth and Dorothy Joplin, were good people. Her father worked at the Texaco refinery. Her mother had once wanted to be a singer herself, but had given up that dream to raise a family. They loved Janis, but they did not understand her. Nobody in Port Arthur did. When she started listening to blues records, to Bessie Smith and Lid Billy and Odetta, her parents worried. When she started painting, writing poetry, reading books that nobody in her school had ever heard of, they worried more. And when she started saying things out loud that girls in Port Arthur were not supposed to say, things about civil rights, about segregation being evil, about the world being bigger than Texas, the worry turned into something closer to fear. But the real wound started in high school. At Thomas Jefferson High School, Janis was different in every way a teenage girl could be different in the conservative South of the 1950s. She had acne that left scars on her face. She had gained weight. She wore black tights and men's shirts when other girls wore poodle skirts. She spoke her mind in a place where girls were supposed to smile and stay quiet, and for this she was punished. Her classmates called her names that are too ugly to repeat here. They threw pennies at her in the hallways, a cruelty meant to mock her, to tell her she was worthless. They laughed when she walked into rooms. They laughed when she walked out. By the time she graduated, Janis had been so deeply wounded by her hometown that she could not wait to escape, and the University of Texas in Austin seemed like the escape she had been waiting for. But the real cut was still ahead of her. Austin in 1962 was supposed to be different. It was a college town, a place with coffee houses and folk music and long conversations about poetry. Janis had heard that there were beatniks there, artists, people who lived outside the lines. And for a few weeks after she arrived, it felt like she had finally found her tribe. She started hanging out at a place called Threadgill's, an old gas station that had been turned into a bar where folk musicians played on Wednesday nights. The owner, Kenneth Threadgill, saw something in her. He let her sing on stage, just a young girl with an auto harp and a voice that did not sound like anything anyone had heard before. A voice that was raw, cracked, powerful, full of something that could not be taught. For the first time in her life, Janis felt like she belonged somewhere, but the University of Texas was not Threadgill's. The university was a fraternity and sorority culture, a world of debutante balls and football games and social hierarchies as rigid as anything in Port Arthur. And Janis, with her unstraightened hair, her bare feet, her refusal to wear makeup, her loud laugh, her louder opinions, stood out like a crack in a perfect mirror. The fraternities on campus had a tradition. Every year, they held a contest called the Ugliest Man on campus. It was supposed to be a joke, a fundraiser. The idea was that male students would be nominated, and people would vote for them by putting money in jars. The person who raised the most money through votes would be crowned the winner, and the money would go to charity. It was a silly, cruel tradition, the kind of thing that college boys thought was funny in an era when cruelty was often disguised as humor. But in the fall of 1963, something happened that had never happened before in the history of that contest. A group of fraternity brothers decided to nominate a girl. They nominated Janis Joplin, and they did not just nominate her as a prank. They campaigned for her. They put up posters of her around campus. They collected money. They made sure everyone knew who she was and why they had picked her. The message was clear, brutal, and public. They were telling the entire university that this girl, This young woman who had come to Austin hoping to finally find a place where she could breathe was so ugly, so repulsive, so wrong-looking that she deserved to be voted the ugliest man on campus. Not the ugliest woman, the ugliest man, because to these boys she was not even worth the category of woman. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it would feel like to be 19 years old, to have finally left behind the town that hurt you, to have finally started to believe that maybe you could build a life somewhere you were seen, and then to walk across a campus and see posters with your face on them. Posters asking people to pay money to declare you the ugliest thing on that campus. She did not win the contest. She did not even come close to winning. But that was not the point. The point was that she had been nominated at all. The point was that it had been public. The point was that every single student at the University of Texas now knew that Janis Joplin had been nominated as the ugliest man on campus. But the deepest wound was not the nomination itself. The wound was what it did to her belief that she could ever be accepted anywhere. She had tried so hard. She had come to Austin with her auto harp and her dreams and her desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she could finally find a place where people did not hate her for what she looked like. And the people at her new university had taken that hope and crushed it in the most public way they could think of. For weeks after the nomination, Janis could barely leave her dorm room. She cried until there were no tears left. She stopped going to classes. She stopped eating. The girl who had been starting to sing at Threadgill's, the girl who had been starting to feel alive, went quiet. The people who knew her during that time said she looked like a ghost, a shadow of herself, a young woman who had been taught one more time that the world did not want her. And then, in the spring of 1963, a journalism student at the university decided to write a profile about her for the school newspaper. The student's name was Patricia Sharp, and the article would eventually appear in the Daily Texan. Patricia had heard about the ugliest man on campus incident and wanted to understand who this girl really was. She interviewed Janis, and Janis, still bleeding from the wound, told her the truth. She talked about feeling like an outsider. She talked about the nomination. She talked about what it felt like to be mocked for how she looked. The article ran, and for a brief moment, people at the university felt a flicker of shame. A few students apologized. A few professors reached out, but most people just moved on because in 1963 the suffering of a strange, loud, unconventional girl was not something that most people were willing to sit with for very long. Janis dropped out of the University of Texas not long after. She packed her suitcase, kissed her friends at Threadgill's goodbye, and boarded a bus heading west to San Francisco, to a city where she had heard things were different, where people were building something new, where maybe, just maybe, she could finally be seen. But the story does not end there, because what happened in Austin did not stay in Austin. That wound, that moment, that public humiliation traveled with her. It followed her to San Francisco. It followed her into every coffee house where she started singing. It followed her into every rehearsal with the band that would eventually become Big Brother and the Holding Company. It followed her onto the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, the performance that would introduce her to the world. And it followed her into every interview, every photograph, every recording session, every crowded room where people now wanted to love her for the same voice they had once tried to silence. And here is the thing that the boys at the University of Texas never understood. The thing they could not have known. The thing that makes this story something more than a story about cruelty. That wound was what made her. The rawness in her voice that would eventually stop thousands of people in their tracks. That would make grown men cry at her concerts. That would make her one of the most celebrated singers of her generation. That rawness was not something she learned in a conservatory. It was not something she practiced. It was not a technique. It was a scar. It was the sound of a young woman who had been hurt so deeply, so publicly, so many times, that when she opened her mouth to sing, every single wound came out with the notes. When Janis sang the blues, she was not performing. She was telling the truth. She was singing about what it felt like to be the girl with posters of her face on the fraternity house walls. She was singing about what it felt like to walk across a campus and know that people had paid money to call her ugly. She was singing about what it felt like to grow up in a world that kept telling her she did not belong. And because she was singing the truth, people listened. In 1967, just 4 years after the University of Texas tried to publicly humiliate her, Janis Joplin walked onto the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival. She was 24 years old. The audience did not know who she was. The cameras almost missed her performance because the filmmakers did not think she was important enough to film. But when she started singing, everything stopped. People who were there that day said they had never heard anything like it. A young woman with frizzy hair and no makeup, wearing clothes that looked like she had thrown them together from a thrift store, singing with a voice that sounded like it had been carved out of pain and survival, and something close to holy fire. By the end of her performance, the festival was hers. Mama Cass Elliot, one of the most famous singers in the country at the time, was filmed in the audience with her mouth literally hanging open. Within weeks, Janis Joplin was on the cover of major magazines. Within months, her band had signed a record deal. Within a year, she was one of the most famous singers in the world. But pause here for a moment, because the transformation was not just about fame. The transformation was about something much deeper. The boys at the University of Texas had tried to tell Janis that her face, her body, her way of being in the world was so wrong that it deserved to be mocked in front of thousands of people. And Janis, instead of hiding, instead of changing herself to fit what they wanted, instead of apologizing for existing, did something almost unimaginable. She doubled down. She grew her hair longer and wilder. She wore feathers and beads and clothes that refused to pretend. She laughed louder. She drank harder. She loved more openly. She took everything about herself that Port Arthur and Austin had told her was wrong, and she turned it into her identity. She took the very things that had been used as weapons against her, and she made them into her art. This is the part of the story that most people miss. The revenge was not a performance. The revenge was not a speech. The revenge was not a confrontation with the boys who had nominated her. The revenge was her entire life. Every time she walked onto a stage and sang with her whole scarred self, every time she refused to change to fit someone else's idea of what a woman should look like, every time she took the microphone and made 20,000 people feel less alone, she was answering the University of Texas. She was answering Port Arthur. She was answering every person who had ever told her she was too strange, too loud, too ugly, too much. She was saying, with every note, the same thing over and over again. You tried to make me small. And look what happened instead. In 1970, less than 7 years after the Ugliest Man on Campus nomination, Janis Joplin returned to Port Arthur for her 10th high school reunion. It was one of the most documented and strange moments of her career. She flew in with a film crew. She wore a purple and blue satin outfit, feathers in her hair, a boa around her neck. She walked into the reunion where the same people who had thrown pennies at her in the hallways were now middle-aged, working regular jobs, living regular lives, and they all wanted her autograph. A reporter asked her at a press conference in Port Arthur if she was going to the reunion to rub it in their faces. Janis laughed, but the laugh was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had spent her whole life trying to understand why the people she had grown up with had been so cruel to her. When the reporter asked her about her high school years, she said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. She said that she had been the kind of girl that her classmates had not wanted to know. She said that she had been laughed out of Texas, and she said it with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. That night, at the reunion itself, something happened that almost nobody talks about. Janis sat at a table and watched the people who had tormented her as a teenager walk past her one by one, asking for autographs, telling her they had always believed in her, claiming they had been her friends. And Janis signed the autographs. She smiled. She played the role of the famous singer who had come home triumphant. But later, back at her hotel room, she cried. Friends who were with her that night said she cried for hours, because the truth was that no amount of fame, no amount of gold records, no amount of standing ovations could ever fully heal the wound that had been opened in her when she was a teenager in a town that did not want her. This is the part that makes Janis Joplin's story so human, so painful, so important. She became one of the greatest singers of the 20th century. She sold millions of records. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Her voice changed the course of popular music forever. She inspired generations of female singers, from Stevie Nicks to Melissa Etheridge to Florence Welch, who have all cited her as the reason they believed they could take the stage as their whole, unfiltered selves. She did everything that a young woman from Port Arthur was never supposed to do, and yet, underneath it all, she was still the girl who had been nominated as the ugliest man on campus. Still the girl who had been laughed at in high school hallways. Still the girl who had gotten on a bus out of Austin because she could not bear to walk across that campus one more time. Fame did not heal her. Success did not heal her. The love of millions of fans did not heal her, because the wound had gone too deep, because the cruelty had started too young, because some scars, even when they become the very thing that makes you powerful, never fully close. Janis Joplin died in October of 1970, just 3 months after that strange and painful homecoming in Port Arthur. She was 27 years old. She died alone in a hotel room in Los Angeles. And when the news reached the world, it reached the University of Texas too. It reached Port Arthur. It reached every person who had ever mocked her, thrown pennies at her, voted for her in a cruel contest designed to tell her she was worthless. Some of them, we know from later interviews, felt guilty. Some of them tried to say they had never participated. Some of them claimed they had always known she was special. Most of them just stayed silent. Because there is nothing to say when the girl you once tried to destroy becomes a legend and then dies before she can ever fully enjoy what she built. But here is the part of the story that matters most. The part that turns this from a tragedy into something else. Something closer to a lesson that we all need to hear. The people who tried to humiliate Janis Joplin at the University of Texas did not win. They thought they did. They thought that by nominating her for that contest, they were putting her in her place. They were telling her that she did not belong, that she was ugly, that she was wrong, that she should shrink. But instead, without knowing it, they were pouring fuel on a fire that was already starting to burn. They were giving her, one more time, a reason to refuse to be small. They were adding to the pain that would eventually come out of her as a voice that shook the world. Every person who ever loved a Janis Joplin song, every person who ever felt less alone because of her music, every person who ever heard her sing and thought, yes, that is what it feels like to be alive, owes something to the boys at the University of Texas. Because those boys in their cruelty helped build the singer who would go on to save so many other people. And this is the strange and terrible truth about pain. Sometimes it breaks us, sometimes it destroys us, sometimes, as it did with Janis in the end, it takes more from us than it gives. But sometimes if we are lucky, if we are strong enough, if we have even one person in our lives who sees us and tells us we are real, the pain becomes the raw material for something extraordinary. Janis Joplin was that raw material. She was the girl who was told she was the ugliest man on a campus, and she turned that wound into one of the most beautiful voices in the history of American music. She was the girl who was laughed out of her hometown, and she turned that laughter into lyrics that made millions of people feel less alone. She was the girl who did not belong anywhere, and she built a place where every outsider, every strange kid, every girl who was told she was too much, could come and listen and know that someone had lived what they were living. She did not get to enjoy it for long. She did not get the long life she deserved. She did not get to grow old and tell her own story in her own time. But the voice she left behind is still here. The songs are still playing. The raw, cracked, holy sound of a young woman who refused to be silenced is still reaching people who need to hear it. And somewhere, in some old yearbook at the University of Texas, there is still a record of a cruel contest in the fall of 1963, a nomination that was supposed to be a joke, a campaign that was supposed to hurt. The boys who made that campaign are mostly forgotten now. Their names are not in any history books. Their faces are not on any posters. Their voices are not in any recordings. But the girl they tried to shame, the girl they tried to crush, the girl they paid money to call the ugliest thing on their campus, her name is written on stars on sidewalks. Her voice is in music libraries across the world. Her face is on album covers, on posters, on murals, on t-shirts worn by teenage girls who were not even born when she died. Her name is Janis Joplin. And every time one of her songs plays somewhere in the world, every time a young person who feels like an outsider hears her voice and feels a little less alone, the boys who tried to destroy her lose one more time. They lose and she wins, and she keeps winning every single day, in every single room where her music still lives. That is the answer she gave, not with words, not with revenge, not with a speech or a confrontation or a public takedown of the people who had hurt her. She answered with her entire life. She answered by becoming exactly and completely the person they had tried to tell her she was not allowed to be. And if you have ever been told that you are too much, or not enough, or too strange, or too loud, or too quiet, or too weird, or too ugly, or too anything at all, listen to her voice. Listen to the scars in it. Listen to the way she holds nothing back, the way she lets every wound show, the way she refuses to be small. Because the voice of Janis Joplin is not just music. It is a message, it is a promise. It is a reminder that the people who try to make you smaller do not get to write the last chapter of your story. You do. You always do. And sometimes, if you are brave enough and honest enough, and willing to let the world hear the sound of your truest self, the story you write will be the one that survives. The boys who nominated her for that cruel contest are gone. Their laughter has faded. Their posters are dust. But Janis Joplin, the girl they tried to humiliate, is still singing. Somewhere right now, in somebody's headphones, in somebody's car, in somebody's quiet room at 3 in the morning, when they feel like the world is too heavy to carry, she is singing. And that is the answer. That has always been the answer. That will always be the answer. The wound became the voice became the legend. And the legend will outlast every single person who ever tried to tell her she was not enough.